A very good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final panel session of YPO's Net Zero Week. In this final session, we've got an illustrious panel of senior public sector climate change and procurement experts, and we're going to reflect on some of the key insights that have been highlighted during the Net Zero Week, talk about perhaps what some of the priorities might be and the challenges that we face along the way, and I think very specifically, what is the role that procurement plays in tackling the climate emergency, and the role that the public sector more generally can play in leading by example to truly champion the decarbonisation agenda. We have a very experienced panel representing a quantum of local government activity. So very pleased to welcome Peter Schofield, Head of Integrated Commissioning and Procurement from Manchester City Council. Good morning, Peter. Martin Budd, Manager for Council. Morning, Martin.
Morning.
Joe Osborne, Regional Commercial Director from Blue Light Commercial. Morning and welcome, Joe.
Morning.
Holly Wilson, Head of Strategic Procurement from Doncaster Council. Hi, Holly.
Good morning.
And Kevin Dracy, Head of Procurement and Contract Management from North Yorkshire County Council. Good morning, Kevin.
Morning.
So let's kick off with Peter, if we may, to start the discussion. Just kind of high level, Peter. Could you explain, in your opinion, why procurement is such an important factor for the public sector decarbonisation agenda?
Yeah, sure, Simon. Thanks. Yeah, I think we've probably all seen over the course of the week that we've got a handle on our direct emissions by now. You know, most people have adopted a net zero target, some more challenging than others, 2038. And you know, zero carbon is a top priority for the city and for Manchester City Council itself. And it's one of the headline objectives in our Manchester strategy refresh. We've got senior leaders in the council, the executive members, and the senior management team are all involved in this. We've got a zero carbon coordination group, 5 different work streams, chaired by the deputy chief exec, and I lead on the work stream 3, which is reducing consumption-based emissions and influencing suppliers. And the reason that we're looking at that now is that we've already been at this for a while, and I think most people have. We've achieved a 50% reduction in our direct emissions between 2010 and 2020, based on the baseline. We've got measures in place for another 50% in direct emissions until 2025. We've done this through buildings and energy strategies, LED streetlights, retrofit using our own capital and funding allocation of the sources. And that's kind of addressed scopes 1 and 2 of the greenhouse gas protocol. And the tough one, I think, is the scope 3 emissions, the upstream and downstream indirect emissions that come from our supply chain, much more difficult to measure and to control. So, you know, we're using procurement to drive down consumption emissions and really to make the supply chain aware of their obligations and the part they can play. And that's a key action in our climate change action plan. So we've got a range of initiatives within procurement, the eradicating single-use plastics from catering contracts and franchises. We've got a lot of markets, big Christmas market in Manchester, parks, concessions and things like that. So we've said to suppliers, no more single-use plastics. I think the big one is that historically, I think Manchester's been one of the leaders in relation to, we've used it since 2006 to look at specific Manchester-related deprivation issues, and we were one of the first councils to have a 20% weighting in our procurement for social value when the Social Value Act came out in 2012. We've now gone to 30% by including another 10% of the evaluation to carbon reduction activity. So previously, we'd use social value to identify suppliers that share the Manchester values if they want to win a contract, and then contribute to growth and vibrancy within the city through their kind of activities in relation to the social value they deliver. So the additional 10% will ensure that suppliers share our commitment to reach carbon zero by 2038. So in time, specifications that we issue will be better informed, be more, the people writing them will be more carbon literate, and zero carbon will come through the way it is. But in the meantime, the idea is that we'll see it as a red line that we've set for our suppliers, that if you want to win a contract in Manchester, you've got to share our values in relation to zero carbon. Obviously, we can't just unleash that and say, let's see what happens. So we've got to help suppliers to understand what sorts of things we're looking for. So we're developing a toolkit for procurers and for suppliers to make sure that market briefings, pre-procurement, make our intentions clear. And short answer to your question, which I know this hasn't been, is that many suppliers are really taking this seriously themselves, not starting from zero, but it's drastic action that's needed. And a hardline approach is going to be taken through procurement, because we'll never get anything like full decarbonisation in the timescales that we've identified.
Thanks, Peter. I wonder if I could turn to Martin, because clearly, Peter's explained the extent to which decarbonisation is built into the procurement activity that he leads. You've got more of a kind of an oversight of the broader activity within Hull City Council as climate change manager. Do you think the role of procurement is recognised more widely?
I think it is. I think it's a growing thing. I think it's one of those areas that I think historically people haven't recognised the key role that procurement plays and procurement professionals play in the process. And I think there needs to be a much stronger relationship between the procurement professionals and those that specify. I think, it's a two-way thing. It's around those that specify works and services, understanding how net zero affects those and what the questions they need to ask. But also procurement professionals having that knowledge themselves and being able to be a robust challenge in the specification process. So not just making sure that it follows procurement rules, but actually saying, well, actually, how have you actually built this into the way you're thinking about it? How are you starting to relate to your supply chains? And I think it's an education process that, that we're all going through in trying to do that. And certainly for us, our consumption emissions are about 1.8%, 1.8 times our production emissions. So it's fundamental that we get this right. And in terms of being able to develop and support our local supply chain, it's really important. So it's a significant economic development opportunity to how we relate to our local supply chain, our local suppliers, and how we develop them and bring them on board. But it also means that they're actually in a better position when they procure for contracts outside of the public sector or with other parts of the public sector. They already understand what the expectations are, what the demands are, and they're able to meet those and come to those. So it's that two-way conversation. I think there certainly is, amongst, it's a greater need for that CPD amongst within professionals that both, within the procurement framework, but outside as well, to actually so it increases their knowledge and their understanding of how it relates. And certainly within the authority, our procurement professionals sort of move from, I suppose, one area of procurement to another, as part of their career and part of their development, as we move resources around, to where there are, I suppose, pinch points in terms of capacity. So there is a need for the professionals to understand how those skills are transferable to different contracts and different specifications. So understanding what net zero means and what the key issues are, then enables them to actually transfer those skills to different areas where they're in providing much more of a commissioning procurement role with social care and children's services, to one with a much more of a development of regeneration of building construction and that kind of thing. So there's a huge opportunity, but also a steep learning curve. And I think that's one of the things that certainly as a climate change and managing a climate change team is that we support and assist people as they move through this, because it's a whole new area of work that they've got to understand and get to grips with, and it can feel quite intimidating, I think, because it's it's a new area and it touches so many factors in everything that we do. So I think it's about us holding and learning together about how it actually works and what's the best way of doing it that actually makes it easy for us in terms of procurement process, so it works and it's smooth, but also so we enable services to have a much better understanding of actually what their role is in specifying correctly. So it makes it much easier for procurement professionals to just sense check it rather than having to do it, because they're not they've got a level of specialism in procurement and in the services they're working, but they're not the specialist in healthcare provision or building construction. So there's a two-way stream really. We've got to help each other because that's the only way we're going to get there. We can't just rely upon one or the other to actually have all the knowledge. It's about bringing those two levels of knowledge and experience together, and that's what we're trying to do in the city, is actually bring that together and do the training element. And picking up the point, Peter's point, that carbon literacy becomes really key to people understand what it means and how we translate that into actually how we operate and work.
Thanks, Martin. And I suppose the trend in recent years of fewer and fewer council services actually being delivered by the council, by direct council employees, and more being outsourced, just raises the role of procurement and the management of the supply chain even greater. Have you seen that, Kevin, in your own authority?
Yeah, so when we've looked at our carbon cost at North York Council, it's clear our supply chains are by far the biggest contributor. So whilst it's important that our own internal behaviour and our own internal actions as an organisation are key, it would be remiss of us to not look to try and influence the supply chain, because some of our biggest impacts and biggest wins can come in that area. So I think it's clear in the work that we are doing that absolutely supply chain, and first of all the carbon impact, but then trying to influence it is going to be where we can make some really big wins come in the future.
Thank you. Holly, if we could turn to you, and just interested in your own experience as an enabler towards your organisation's sustainable strategy. What role do you actually play on a day-to-day basis? How do you go about that, championing the climate change agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think environmental and sustainability has been part of procurement life for a long time. My background is the NHS and housing, so it's always been a key driver through those sectors. In local government, in Doncaster, for example, we've been a victim of significant environmental changes in the UK. So in 2019, we had the floods, which did affect Doncaster quite significantly. Also in 2020, to add to the woes of COVID, we also had peatland, which we're on a significant piece of peatland in the UK. So we've sort of been a victim directly of quite a lot of environmental. So that sort of heightened the agenda for environmental and sustainability. We declared the we declared the climate emergency in 2019, and that sort of, from that, there was a rewrite of the environmental and sustainable strategy, which I think up to that point had probably skirted around the edges of what we needed to do. So from a procurement perspective, what we've done, like as I've said, we've always took a proactive role around environmental considerations in procurement, but I think with the new world that we're living in, of carbon zero, net zero, and so on, that I think it's going to give us more support, I suppose, to deliver those environmental aspirations of the organisation. So from the 2020 strategy, I'm relaunching the procurement strategy, which will heavily have within it the environmental ambitions of the authority. But I suppose I think the word enabler is the correct word. As in procurement, we are part of a bigger jigsaw of enablement for the authority to get net zero across, in my case, across Doncaster. One of the key things, and a really good thing that I think the Doncaster Council has done, is that we've not launched an environmental and sustainable strategy in isolation. This has been something that's been launched as part of Team Doncaster, and that contains a lot of public sector, private, voluntary, community type companies. So it's about getting the borough as a whole and the key players within it to own the strategy, and not just sort of it just be driven from local government. So into specifics of what procurement's done, we've always put a heavy emphasis on local spend. And I think, again, this backs up that direction of the council, because it's, not rocket science that if you buy more locally, you've got less people travelling into the borough. And again, that's obviously positive from a carbon perspective. We've written that into our contract procedure rules, which are part of the way that the rules which govern how we contract. So that's been written in, that local firms must be considered, obviously within the legislation that we all have to work to. When we take on large contractors to do work, so big development works, we do ensure that they engage with local communities and local suppliers to try and, again, cut those carbon footprints of subcontractors potentially coming out of borough, and they're monitored through KPIs on their supply chains. So, for example, we've recently done a new motorway link road. The KPI was within 10 miles you must source your materials, and we are quite we're quite conveniently based logistically for a lot of supply chain. We sort of sit in the middle of the A1, M62 and M1 and A1. So we do have quite a lot of supply around us. So that's a KPI within. We've also introduced a system called Social Value Portal, and a lot of authorities across Yorkshire and Humber have done the same. And this is a way for us, again, to push through social value in our contracting, and part of that being sustainability. We have a 10% minimum, which I know Manchester, obviously they are ahead of the curve on this with 30%, but we've put 10% as a minimum within our evaluation criteria for contracts above 189k. And that, again, pushes that sustainability message. And I think to pick up on some of what my colleagues have said, I think, it's the little wins, but they do turn into bigger things. So, it's part of procurement behaviour. Procurement professionals for years, our job is to challenge on specifications, to drive through value for money through contracting. And I think as part of that, we've added it into the sustainability question. Is this specification the best from a sustainability perspective? And there are small wins through that, like the single-use plastics elimination and catering consumables, for example. Looking at more sustainable timber products. So there are those smaller sort of wins. There's other things that we can do. So, and we have done. It's like early engagement with supply chains. So, doing the market engagement early on, talking to the supply base, because they are best placed to advise us on what are the innovations within those sectors, what they feel they can do more efficiently and sustainably. And I think, there's other things that we've done specifically in Doncaster is I've set up an public sector anchors procurement group, and that is bringing together all public sector procurement heads of in Doncaster. So that's the NHS, the Housing Association, and so on. And it's about bringing them together and having those conversations around social value and sustainability. And I think local government, we are quite, I think we are ahead of the curve with some of this. When speaking to NHS colleagues, other NHS colleagues may say not, but there's been a real drive to lower around the bottom line, the cost as over anything else. Whereas we've had a lot of political pressure with regards to sustainability and social value already. So they're sort of, we're helping them to develop their social value policies, their sustainability policies. So that's a real positive in Doncaster. So yeah, that's where we're at.
You mentioned along the way there, Holly, about kind of setting targets for suppliers. And one of the things I should mention, we've got questions coming in on the webinar as we're speaking. So thank you to everybody that's raising questions. I should say that any that we don't manage to address during the session, we will publish answers to afterwards. There are a number of questions around measurement. So how are we actually how are we measuring outputs directly? How are we constructing KPIs and SLAs to make sure that tangible outcomes are being delivered? How are we increasing costs? What tools do we use to measure Scope 3? What tools and methods are you asking suppliers to use to measure emissions? So there's a bit of a theme, actually. There's a number of questions on the same kind of theme as I say that you picked up there, Holly. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Is there a common approach across local government, and should there be? How are we measuring what actually happens, and how are we setting targets? Kevin, I wonder if we could come to you to start with
that. In terms of is there a common approach, the Yorkshire and Humber Strategic Procurement Group is taking part in a piece of work at the moment. We've had our procurement strategies assessed. We've had our approaches assessed, and unsurprisingly, there is an inconsistent approach to it.
Yep.
And at North Yorkshire, we have a long way to go on this. So in terms of how we measure, that's something that we are developing now. And there's some areas of really good practice in our region. But obviously, we're different authorities, different sizes, different geography. But I think in terms of where we are as a region, we are sharing best practice. As Holly just said, a very developed area in that area. I think as we move forward, we will standardise on that approach. But at the moment, it's very different depending on which local authority you are working with.
Peter, you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Holly mentioned working with the anchor institutions, and that's something that I think really matters. So we've got, I mentioned the partnership across Manchester, which is looking at climate change. It's called the Climate Change Partnership, would you believe? And so we've got two universities that are part of that. So they've got an eye on their own emissions and their own carbon impact, but they've also got access to research and people that will do research projects, funding for research, etc. And we're kind of relying on them, I think, to some extent, to say, okay, well, as members of this partnership, what can you do to kind of rationalise this measurement without inventing a whole new tool? Is there something out there that we should be standardising on? Because, as Kevin said, everybody uses something different. I think the trick will be when you then start applying it to your own suppliers, and they say, well, we've already for the last 5 years been using this approach, and we can report on our performance over 5 years using our measurement technique, which is different to yours. So, overall, it is a tough one, but our approach is going to be to say to suppliers, what are you already doing? And they'll get a certain amount of credence for that in relation to the score. But then it's going to be the life of this contract. And we're more about, I think, at this stage, what actions are they taking? Because there are different opportunities in different industries, different supply chain areas have got different opportunities as well. And you can only really work on what you've got in front of you. So we'll take account of their specific proposals, but overall there's got to be a demonstration that they understand the agenda and they're committed to improving against it. And
so the thinking is as long as they're doing something, that's a good start, and then in time we'll work towards standardization. But actually taking action at all is the most important thing.
It's got to be credible action. They can't say, oh yeah, if we win this contract, we will improve our recycling or something like that. It's got to be, well, why you can do that anyway. So what are you already doing? What will you do over the life of this contract in the way you deliver the service to have that zero carbon? So demonstration that they are taking it seriously is the first thing. I suppose that's that. It's not easy.
Joe, I wonder if I could bring you in on this one, because it strikes. Sorry, Martin, I will come back to you in a second. it strikes me that one of the challenges that the people that have spoken so far have is managing standardization across suppliers within a single organization. One of the common links that you and I have is that we have a diverse membership of very different organizations, so that kind of standardization and measurement challenge is probably even greater for both of us. Do you see that?
It is, absolutely. Blue Light Commercial support the 43 forces across England and Wales, but we also have a number of other members. We work closely with the emergency services. We've got overseas territories as well. So it is a challenge, and we've got 43 people doing it differently. So the challenge for us is to sort of look at some pull together. We already have a sustainable tool that we use for our suppliers, a tool called Net Positive. So we're looking at how we can develop that, and we are taking a lead for commercial transformation across policing. So these are things that are really key on our agenda. We've recently had the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, and what's clear from the new incumbents is that this is really high up on the agenda, which helps support that. And there is a commitment from both Home Office, Chief Constables and PCCs to do this in a standardised way. So that will help us, but it is a challenge, and I wouldn't say that we're there at this moment in time.
Thank you, Joe. Martin, sorry, you wanted to come in earlier.
Yeah, just similar to Peter, what the approach that we need to get it more robust is we've just taken our environmental policy statements, which we have within the procurement, and said to suppliers, how will you help us deliver our environmental policy statement through the way you deliver the service? So getting them to actually think about, well, how do we actually, just trying to get them to think about how their service delivery can support us in that way. But you're quite right, everybody said, it's getting some more standardized measurements and KPIs is really important, because I think it makes it much easier, much clearer to the market then what we're asking for and what we're looking for. And it makes it much easier for us to sort of compare each other's performance as well, and where the opportunities are for co-working.
We've talked so far in a very positive way about our role as champions, enablers, pushing the agenda forward. But of course, part of that role is to address barriers that exist. And there are inevitably barriers to implementing this agenda. Joe, I wonder if you could expand on some of the kind of challenges and barriers that you face within your organisation.
Okay, yes, of course. So, as I said, 43 forces. Some of our biggest challenges at the moment are in the fleet area. So we've talked to both Chief Constables and Police and Crime Commissioners priorities, and we're going to be focusing on energy, the estate in general, which is changing, particularly in the light of the COVID pandemic, but the vehicles as well. So we have a fleet of 40,000 vehicles across the country, and some of those are fast response vehicles. So whilst we have started to look at ultra low emission vehicles with some of the non-response ones, so far there's only about 2% of them that are like that. So before we get to 2030, which essentially is really only 2 rounds of replacement cycles, we've got a huge hill to climb. A compounded is obviously the charging infrastructure. Unfortunately, we can't just park police cars up on a street and charge them overnight. Some of our buildings are very old. We like to lock things up and have gates and security access. So I think the challenge for us is really working in a collaborative way, working with partners across local authorities and other agencies to look at how we can improve the charging infrastructure. The funding of that will be critical as well. But then also challenging the culture across policing. They're used to driving cars that are feel differently. And so for our police officers, they need to be trained to drive different types. Our technicians also need to go through training because they're not necessarily equipped to do that at the moment. And we're working really closely with manufacturers at the moment because the range is changing almost every few months to see what the next generation looks like for us. So I think for us, the biggest challenge at the moment sits around that fleet and charging infrastructure, because that's where we make the biggest impact with carbon.
Thank you. Glancing at the questions that are coming in again, and again, we have quite a few kind of bunched together around cost. And the issue of the potential tension between carbon reduction and cost reduction. So as procurement professionals, most of us with cost reduction as the highest priority. But there is an offset, and some of the reductions in carbon and the overall organisation-wide savings that might flow from that don't manifest themselves in procurement pricing. How do we resolve that tension? And is it a tension? Is it an inevitability that there is a cost to carbon reduction? Kevin, do you want to kick us off on that one?
I agree. I think there is a tension. So we've just gone through a long period of austerity where the unashamed focus has been on cost reduction, on savings, on driving cost, the supply. And there sometimes is a view that for social value or for carbon reduction, it means we have to pay more. So immediately, sometimes people's minds already have a bias against it before we've even started. So I think one of the key areas, and I think it's before, is around how we work at the commissioning stage, so the pre-procurement stage, how we actually influence the decision makers, so politicians, senior officers. How do we make the case? And actually, it's incumbent on us to bring the data and intelligence to this debate, to say, actually, to do things better, to do things that will reduce carbon usage, it actually doesn't always cost more, and actually can be more beneficial for us in terms of bottom line cost. So if we can bring that intelligent debate to that commissioning discussion and actually help the people who are making those decisions come to that conclusion, the next in the procurement work that then flows out of it will be in a much better place. But that is a difficult debate to get into and to win at the moment.
Sure. Martin, do you have that debate within your own authority around the tension?
We do indeed.
Or do you try to ignore it and just plough ahead?
No, I don't think you can ignore it. I think the challenges that we have is how you actually factor in the cost of not doing it and how you put a price on that. And I think that's one of the difficult things, because a lot of improvements and a lot of energy reduction have been driven by a spend to save motive. And, depending on our organisation, have different periods of how long that has to operate for. So there's a cost of actually not doing it. And it's not just a cost in terms of our net zero targets. I think the one area that really, I think we're collectively, as organisations across the public sector, is that we're not factoring in the adaptive cost, the climate adaptation costs, and the risks and the climate change risks associated with procurement decisions and options. And certainly the publication this week of the Climate Change Risk Assessment 3 that came out was really a damning indictment of government policy around adaptation. And, for those of us that have worked in this area, have worked for a long time, procurement, production emissions have been severely under-resourced in terms of addressing those. That compared to adaptation really is the sort of the forgotten child locked in the cupboards when it comes to it. And I think that's a whole nother area in terms of where I think, specifiers and sort of, procurement professionals need to understand what climate adaptation impacts are, because that adds another cost. I think that's quite a difficult discussion when you're having with specifiers of saying, well, I want to build X, and this is what I want to do. So, okay, well, what's the climate adaptation? How risky is that? How are we going to have to retrofit that for net zero and for adaptation if we don't do it as part of this procurement process? So it's a very difficult discussion, and really is a cultural and, for some professionals, a psychological change in how they've been educated and how they've learned and their profession has grown. And I think so there are some quite fundamental changes in terms of how we think as local government professionals around this, regardless of whether we're in procurement professionals or professionals in other parts. There's some really key challenges there we need to start.
Holly, do you see that in Doncaster, the tension between cost and the climate change agenda?
Yeah, to echo what Kevin said, I mean, we've undergone some severe budget cuts under austerity. But I think it's about realigning people's thought processes. It is a cultural shift. And I think that obviously culture shifts don't happen overnight. There's a lot of things when you look into to procuring more sustainable products where there are cost savings, reusable items as opposed to disposable. It's going to save money. Recycling furniture, for example. I think sorry, I don't know what terminology. Martin's probably better, but like a circular economy type scenario. So there are actual cost savings, and I suppose it's us as procurement professionals to ensure that we sort of get that message out. The cost model is something that us as procurement professionals have thought about for a long time. You invest to save. Don't put in place items or having to retrofit on things that don't last. It's sort of the basics, and it's for us, I think, to build on that. But yes, I do see those tensions. If it's environmentally savvy products, widgets, then it's going to cost us more. Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if we could move on to thinking about a few recent events that may have helped the agenda that we're talking about and helped the initiative. One of the experiences that I think the world has had from the last 12 months is that the effect of the global pandemic, the increased working from home, the reduction of traffic on the road, the lockdowns have all had the effect of, in the short term, the reducing air pollution and emissions. Do you think that's been a help to the agenda? Or is there a risk that as we get back to normal and easy, that will kind of fade into the background again? Joe, have you got any thoughts on that stuff?
Absolutely. I think that's certainly within policing, as I'm sure with other colleagues, it's really started a different discussion. There was already discussions around sharing buildings, sharing resources, working in a much more agile manner. The public expect to see policing out on the street. The back office staff need to be more flexible. We've had a lot more shared service. So one of our major forces has decided as a result of the pandemic to get rid of their headquarters. We're certainly looking at technology so that officers on the street have got access to the right sort of technology to do things like having to go back into the office and dock in. So absolutely, it's certainly changing policing. We're starting to look at the number of buildings that we need and what those buildings need to look like moving forward. Much more shared facilities, and also where they sit within our communities and where they can be hubs where perhaps some of the community can also make use of some of that space. So I don't think we'll ever go back, certainly within policing, to the way that it was. We've got the Police Officer Uplift Fund, the extra 20,000 officers that the government have given us. And so we've got to make the best of the resources that we've got without just, the initial thought was 20,000 extra officers. That means more vehicles, more buildings. And actually it doesn't. Across our vehicle fleet, we've started looking at the telematics data to see how they're being used. Because obviously the best step is to actually not do things in the first place. You'll go past any police station in the country and see vehicles parked up. So these sort of questions have really, really come to fruition over the last 12 months. And I think it will be a very different landscape moving forwards.
Thank you. Peter, last year been helpful for you or not?
Well, helpful maybe isn't the right word.
Yeah. But, I'm looking for a silver lining here. It's been a challenging year for all of us.
I think some of the lessons learned are you don't have to be in the same room as everybody to have a meeting. But at times it is better. If you're doing a complicated negotiation, you want to see the whites of someone's eyes as you're talking, and you don't always get that over Teams or Zoom. But I do think people have realised that you don't. If you're going to travel, you don't necessarily have to get into a car to do it. And if you're going to meet somebody, you don't have to be next to them. In a lot of cases, I think another thing is that we've collaborated a hell of a lot more. Kind of sharing experiences, sharing ideas. Part of the LGA's National Advisory Group on Procurement, so is Kevin, and the amount of networking and sharing ideas that's gone on over the course of this has led to some really good areas of progress. Going back to the previous topic in terms of challenges and costs, I think it was all very clear to everybody that buying PPE from China might get you the lowest cost, and we were completely dependent on China as a supply chain. But what was the environmental cost of bringing that across? And then what were the actual costs of it in terms of being held at ransom when demand went up across the world and prices escalated? So, making procurement decisions based on lowest price has always been questionable, and it's been something procurement professionals have talked about for a long time. So the pandemic's brought that kind of thinking to the fore. I think people now think, well, what is the overall picture here? The discussion around how do we change and keep those things. I think generally speaking, there's been organisations, and I'm going to talk about Manchester because that's where I work, but I think every local authority has stepped up and shown leadership, and our supply chain haven't been able to deliver what we pay them to deliver, but they've come in and said, okay, we've got people who are still coming to work. They're not fully occupied because they're not necessarily sticking parking tickets on cars anymore. What else can they do to help? And so we've put them into open spaces to talk to people about social gathering and social distancing and so they've reprofiled what they do. And it's all part of people that actually are capable of looking out for one another in the face of a crisis. And obviously a life-threatening crisis, immediate life-threatening crisis, is a lot more visible than something that's going to threaten life in 30 years' time. Going back to adaptation and so on. So we've got to realise that this decade is the one where we've got to act, and we've got to keep those sorts of things together. But you're not going to regenerate the vibrancy of city centres without putting some emissions into the air and spoiling some of the good stuff. So we've got to think about how we build on those behaviours. So the idea of sharing buildings and only going to work 2 days a week, only going to the office 2 days a week, working 5 days a week, obviously, is here to stay.
Martin, as somebody who's 100% focused on this agenda, really, as your day job, have you revision in thinking over the last year? And perhaps you could also pull into that. We've got COP26 in Glasgow later this year. Do you think, again, that's going to help raise the profile and bring this agenda to the forefront?
I think it will do. I think it already is. I think it's becoming, I think the upswelling from local governments around declaring climate emergency and setting carbon neutral net zero targets, I think has had a massive change, I think, across the whole local government sector, and certainly has raised the profile of the debate significantly. I think the past 12 months has shown that that radical change to a new way of doing things is possible and achievable, and that we can do that, and how fleet of foot local government actually is and the public sector is in responding when the crisis hits. I think difficulty with net zero is that the hit, so to speak, is much more stealth-like, but the action has to be today. And I think that's one of the real challenges is trying to get across. Actually, we need to move today to forego the crisis that's going to happen, or the extent of damage that will happen in the future. I think the challenges over the next 12 months are going to be significant, I think, for us within the public sector. The government has a whole slew of strategies that will be coming out from a transport decarbonisation strategy, hydrogen strategy, heating and home strategy, and its net zero strategy. All of those will have significant procurement impacts and changes in terms of how we need to provide services and expectations upon local government. And so our ability, that sort of, I suppose, almost that's the speed and pace of change. I think that's one of the things that I suppose one of the good learnings, that's come out of the 12 months is actually the speed and pace of change that we have to get used to. And I don't think it's how we can continue that momentum, but also not burn everybody out in the process. And I think that's one of the challenges we have at the moment, is that so many of our staff are actually starting to burn out, that have been really at the forefront of actually responding to COVID. Those are much more office based. We've been some distance to some extent from that frontline delivery. We need to understand how we can actually manage that scale and pace and not burn out our staff. There are huge opportunities, and so the next 12 months is a more fundamental change. And I think certainly as we move forward, it's going that pace and scale of change is going to get faster and harder. And the next 9 years are when we're going to make the difference. So we've got 9 hard years of real change that we have to really get on top with and embed this as quickly as possible into this is just how we now do business. And I think that's the challenge that we've got ahead of us.
So you mentioned there how we do business, and of course in procurement, a lot of that is dictated and has traditionally been dictated by the procurement regulations. We've got an opportunity now, a new national procurement policy statement published as a green paper that has been out for consultation, and the revision to the regs that is going to result from us leaving the EU regime and developing a new UK-based regime. Do you think that's helpful in delivering the decarbonisation agenda, and is it perhaps timely? Kevin, with your role on NAG as well as Peter, you've been pretty heavily involved in that. Do you see the opportunity for this agenda?
I think it is. The new National Procurement Policy Statement actually references carbon neutrality, but it's incumbent on us to take that opportunity because it's all very well allowing flexibility, but if us as professionals don't move with that flexibility or take advantage of it, then we won't progress or grasp some of those opportunities that come to us. So I think it certainly does offer a time to reset and ponder how we approach. As we've just talked about, the last 12 months have brought a lot of learning. We've probably compressed into 12 months, years worth of learning. We have new procurement regulations that are coming in, which we've had really good ability to engage on and to shape in terms of how we want that to work for local government. So the key now is to take advantage of that. So less focus on process, more focus on outcome, and how can we be strategic with how we use that. And again, it's key for me, and that's a skills and a behavioural and a cultural shift that we need to make. So as procurement professionals, we've got a real responsibility to use that flexibility, use those new approaches to deliver on some of these outcomes that are really vital to us.
Continuing on the theme, Peter, sorry, do you want to come on in on that?
So, yeah, just I think this is a really key subject. We've got the National Procurement Policy Statement was first drafted, probably 10 months ago, and it's something that we really pushed for, was the freedom to make quick decisions that benefit that support recovery in terms of procurement. So sourcing PPE from local sources, for example, was the big example, but there's been a lot of other ones. And I think overall the leadership of the authority who declared the climate emergency and actions to follow it up would be on my back if I didn't adopt this new freedom, use this new freedom to make a significant difference. And the reason for that is that the leadership are held to account by the residents, and the FOI questions we get in saying, so you declared a carbon emergency or a climate emergency, what have you done? And we really are held to account by the public. So we do have the opportunity to get on with it, and we've got to get on with it. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's really relevant, and it kind of moves us neatly on, because we've just talked about the loosening of government restrictions potentially with the revision of the regulations. But one of the other things that the government has announced this week is new measures that will require business to commit to net zero by 2050 before they can bid for major government contracts. So this is more of the stick approach, if you like. Any thoughts on whether that's a good thing or not, and should local government be adopting a approach? Holly, you got thoughts on that?
I think I've not read it in depth, but I think that the government needs to use policy for the right reasons and help us to drive through certain measures that are positive. I can't see that, and obviously I've not read the detail because there is quite a lot coming out from central government at the moment, as we all know. But it can only be a positive. But again, I'd have to look at the detail. I remember when the Social Value Act came out in 2012. it said consider. For me, it wasn't strong enough. I think at that point, the government missed a trick. If there'd have been more of a drive on you must, then we might have been in a different position to what we are now. So I can only see it as a positive, but again, some other colleagues may have delved into it deeply.
Joe, got any thoughts on that? The thing that strikes me about it, and interested in your views, is does this drive us down the road towards large corporate suppliers who are able to make the commitment and discriminate against the SME business community?
I think that would be one of my concerns. I know certainly as we've been working with suppliers across policing, the smaller ones are the ones the SMEs are struggling, which was the drive behind us putting a tool in place to support them. So I can totally understand. I agree with Holly about the Social Value Act. I think that was very unclear and lots of people didn't take that seriously. So it's that balance, but I think working with suppliers, it's supporting them and working in collaboration, I think, rather than dictating to them, because I do fear it will just be the large suppliers who've got the resources that are able to meet the challenge, if not. So I think there's a responsibility on all of us to think about that and to think about our supply base and how we can offer support as a teams.
Martin, thank you, Joe. Martin, good thing or a bad thing, and should local government be following suit?
I think it's a good thing. I think we've got a national target in the Climate Change Act, so the government has to do this. I think sort of picking up the other points as well. I think it's much clearer now how the different services at local authorities need to be intertwined to deliver this. So it's around what's the role of the economic development teams within supporting local SME sector. If we're going to set these targets or give advance notice and say any procurement from 2030, you must have a net zero target by a particular date. What does that mean in terms of our SME sector? What support do we need to provide into it to different sectors within the SME sector? Where are they? I think we need a much more integrated approach, so we actually use our net zero procurement as a way of strengthening our local supply chains, our local SME sector, and upskilling and reskilling them and transitioning them from maybe products or services that they provide that are high carbon that we just will not want to provide. So the clearest example of that is that we all have liquid fuel contracts. They will all disappear by 2030, or if not before. So for some of us, there may be local businesses that are providing us with those products. We will just take their business away, and that